Welcome to the Sirius report. This is Paul, and once again we're back with another Ukraine briefing. Now recall we put out earlier today a briefing which basically and succinctly describes the fact that NATO was indeed terrified of this new Russian weapon that they utilized in Dnipro to take out a cruise missile production facility. And before we go into detail as to why we're providing another update with respect to that, let's just very briefly recall what this Oreshnik missile is and why it is indeed terrified NATO. It is obviously a Russian intermediate range ballistic missile, an IRBM. It has a range of somewhere between 3,000 and about 5,500 kilometers. Obviously, we made reference to the fact yesterday that under the INF Treaty, these would have been banned, but foolishly Trump walked away from such a treaty, and therefore Russia considers it's perfectly acceptable to produce weapons that are intermediate range, therefore no longer covered by this now defunct INF Treaty. As we said previously, it's capable of reaching speeds exceeding Mach 10, and therefore from a Western missile defense system perspective, they have absolutely nothing which can take down these missiles in any way, shape or form. Obviously, we now know with a bit more detail that it's equipped with multiple independent targetable re-entry vehicles, MIRVs. That means, as we alluded to yesterday, you can have several warheads that can then be directed subsequently at different targets at the same time. So overall, when you look at the characteristics and properties of this Oreshnik missile, the West is indeed terrified because it has affected up the ante with respect to Russia's response. As Russia promised and the West thought it was a bluff, well, it most certainly isn't a bluff. And this is why we're going to now provide an additional update based on this context. Because we noted with interest yesterday that there were reports which have now been confirmed that the new NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, actually had his first meeting with Donald Trump. This meeting was held with Trump in Florida. And of course, the readout's very sort of basically not a great deal of clarity as to what was specifically spoken about. They said, well, we discussed this range of global security issues facing the alliance. I can guarantee there was only one agenda at this meeting, and it was Ukraine. And I can't put words in Trump's mouth, but I strongly suspect Trump basically asked the question, who authorized these ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles to be fired at Russian targets inside the Russian Federation? And are you fully conversant with what this Russian response is? I imagine Trump was particularly angry with respect to recent developments. I think he's been largely pretty quiet. But I think it's very telling having Rutte conducted this meeting with Trump. What do we then find? NATO and Ukraine are set to hold emergency talks after Russia, of course, attacked this military facility in Dnipro using this hypersonic ballistic missile. So these talks are supposed to happen early next week, maybe Tuesday. And of course, the question is, why are they holding this meeting? You can guarantee on the back of whatever Trump sent to Rutte, the now NATO, meaning Rutte's going to sit there with other NATO officials and have a very strong, stern conversation with the Ukrainians. Now, the question is, are they going to listen? Well, they will have to. The other argument is, if indeed, as many people believe it is the case, that only the West is able to operate these ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles, well, that's the end of that venture, because on that basis, there's no way any additional missiles are going to be fired into Russian territory, because the argument comes back to the fact, well, will Russia respond with the same non-nuclear warheads, or maybe they will respond with the nuclear warheads, because we don't know. We can sit there and think it's a bluff. we can sit there and pretend there's no way they will do this. And ordinarily, of course, you would assume that was the case. But, the war's entered a different footing now. Russia made a promise, and so far it has stuck to its promise. It has definitely upped the ante with regards to the weapons they were deploying. They've clearly had this weapon in obviously production and in design for quite some time, and they've chosen this moment to utilize it. And it's not just for symbolic purposes. No doubt they did it to intimidate the West, to make them think twice with regards to future conduct in firing more missiles into Russian territory. As we recall, Putin did have this televised address where he talked about, this was a response to Ukraine using these missiles, which were striking further into Russian territory. And he said, rightly, no one else in the world has these weapons. And absolutely correctly, the Western air defense systems can't stop this missile. He said the testing of the missile will continue, including in combat, if necessary, depending on future security threats to Russia itself. What's now also being confirmed is military officials in Ukraine have said the missile that hit Dnipro had reached this speed, they say, of Mach 11, which is quicker than obviously the Mach 10. And it carried 6 non-nuclear warheads, with each releasing 6 sub-munitions. So that tallies in with the footage we saw, and I'm sure countless other people saw, which definitely looked like there was multiple sub-munitions hitting this target at this cruise missile production facility in Dnipro. Of course, the Western response has been a little bit muted. I mean, on some occasions, people have said, this is not a game changer. But as we said, privately, they're terrified. And now the fact they're now hastily arranging this meeting with Ukraine, I'm sure it's not a meeting to go, well, you can carry on doing this. Does this mean the missiles will stop being fired into Russia? Not necessarily, because we definitely have a power vacuum in Washington, and that is extremely concerning. And we're going to discuss that in another briefing which we'll put out tomorrow. Obviously, that was already recorded and scheduled for tomorrow. Obviously, we've had to preempt that with this additional briefing today. The other thing, of course, is Zelensky's claiming that Ukraine is already working to develop new types of air systems to counter the risk posed by Russia's deployment of this missile. This is nonsense. Nothing in the West is remotely capable of taking down this new missile in any way, shape or form. So Ukraine could be working on this. They'll be working on it a rather long time, and probably years after the war's long since ended. So this, as much as anything, is to try and pacify the Ukrainian people, who are naturally extremely concerned and anxious about this recent development. I think as well it's worth noting there was a news conference in Kiev with Zelensky's Ukrainian counterpart. This was Czech Foreign Minister Lipavsky, who called this missile an escalatory step, an attempt of the Russian leader to scare the population of Ukraine. Well, it most certainly will have. He said to scare the population of Europe. Possibly, I don't doubt there are people in Europe who are going to be very worried about this, because they think the next missile could land somewhere in Europe, which is extremely unlikely. But of course, the Czechs come out and say we'll support the delivery of necessary air defense systems to protect Ukrainians from these Russian attacks. And we're not going to impose any limits on the use of its weapons and equipment given to Ukraine. Well, this is just now becoming ridiculous lip service to a problem that the Ukrainians can never resolve. The war, it'll continue, but the war's long since been over. And this is another example where the West has no capability to shoot these missiles down. So Russia can pretty much fire them whenever they want, at any target they want. And the cooler heads inside NATO, inside the Pentagon, inside even the intelligence agencies are fully aware of this. I hope that whatever Trump said to Rutte is indeed what we suspect it is. And this is this hastily arranged meeting, which hopefully will then put an end to the risk of further escalation. Of course, Ukraine's perfectly entitled to defend itself, given it's a war. But when you start to risk at that level of escalation, and the Americans have known about this, and that's why they've effectively sat there for well over a year and gone, we're not going to give them any permission to use these weapons. And why suddenly that permission was given is a complete mystery. And as I say, that will be in a future briefing out tomorrow. I think it's worth noting finally that Orban made this comment where, and he certainly is perceived to be a bit of a thorn in the side for NATO and the European Union. And he quite rightly said we need to stop underestimating Russia's responses. And also pointing to this new nuclear deployment doctrine that's been changed in Moscow, and don't dismiss any of this as a bluff. Hopefully, with the conversation with Trump, the NATO officials should now be listening to Trump instead. He's the president-elect. You should certainly not be listening to the Biden administration anymore, whoever they are in charge of that, and that's highly debatable given we're now in this transitory phase of governance. And they should be listening to the fact that this is a serious potential escalation, that you should be taking Russia seriously and finding ways to de-escalate this war and prevent the risk of another IRBM being fired from the Russians at some other target, which will probably end up being in Ukraine again. But there comes a point, and the risk is maybe, from the West perspective, they need to start thinking, well, if we push this too far, who knows what the Russian response will be in the future. But there are enough cooler heads who were terrified when this new weapon struck this facility in Dnipro. There's certainly, I think, from the Trump administration or administration to be, certainly enough concern because they want to end the war. Ending the war, from their perspective, isn't firing missiles into Russia that will be shot down 99% of the time by Russian air defense systems. It adds no value to the Ukrainians. It just poses more risk to the Ukrainians, as we've already witnessed. And we will, of course, keep an eye on subsequent developments. We'll see what comes out of this NATO-Ukraine meeting early next week. As ever, be very careful what you hear. Publicly, it's what's going on privately. The fact Rutte's gone to Florida to see Trump is a private indication. The fact this meeting's hastily been arranged early next week is an indication of what's going on privately. But this all bears out what we said in the briefing that went out this morning, that NATO is indeed terrified of this new weapon because they know the next time it could potentially, of course, have a nuclear warhead on it. I'm not suggesting it will in any way, shape or form, but they don't know that. They can sit there thinking it's a bluff, but if they're sufficiently terrified as to what the potential future use will be, then maybe that will lead to de-escalation in this conflict, in a war Ukraine can't win. We might end up seeing peace sooner rather than later. And with that, I end this briefing. And thanks for all your support. Please like, share and subscribe. Spread the word of what we're doing. And with that, I'll say goodbye.